Romanized, African of equestrian rank, but his mother was Italian and related to a prominent Roman family. Though his own immediate family was not particularly influential, his father apparently never held political office, he had two cousins back in Italy, Uncle Publius and Uncle Gaius, who would both serve as consuls during the reign of Antoninus. Gaius Septimius Severus in particular would be the bridge young Lucius used to cross over from obscurity to prominence. The details of his youth are not particularly well known, but he was educated as much as a minor provincial family could afford, and by the time he was 17, his expressed interest in making more of himself than his father had led Uncle Gaius to recommend him to the new emperor, Marcus Aurelius. But despite the endorsement, giving some young provincial a special leg up wasn't on Marcus's to-do list at the time, and so Severus languished in a sort of limbo, waiting patiently to reach the minimum age to serve as quaestor, when it was hoped that Marcus would appoint him to office and simultaneously enroll him in the Senate. And this obviously did not mark him for greatness, as most men destined for the purple had all these age requirements waived and had already served as consul by now. But then again, Severus wasn't aiming to be emperor, he was simply shooting for prominence. Things actually got a little bit worse for young Severus in the mid to late 160s, as he waited patiently for the expected assignment. The Antonine Plague infected Rome, and Severus prudently, if a bit dejectedly, left the diseased capital and returned to Africa where things were safer. He had left home with high hopes, and now he was right back where he had started, with nothing to show for it but a few wasted years. But the plague, which seemed like it might be the final nail in the coffin of whatever grand ambitions Severus secretly harbored for himself, actually turned out to be the defibrillator that brought those ambitions back to life. In addition to being a human tragedy of enormous proportions, the plague had the practical effect of creating many a vacancy in the imperial government. Just as the Second Punic War, and specifically the disaster at Cannae, had cleared out most of the rising stars of the old patrician families and opened the door for men of merit wherever they might be found, so too did the Antonine Plague leave room for men who likely never would have been granted a second look had the old aristocracy not been dropping like flies. I think Pompeianus benefited from these conditions, Pertinax certainly rose higher than he otherwise would have, and young Severus, nobody provincial, would soon find his application for membership in the Senate readily granted, and important business happily heaped upon his shoulders. But even here, Severus's career progressed in fits and starts. He was assigned a proquaestorship in the Spanish senatorial province of Baetica, but soon after taking up the posting his father died, forcing Severus to return home to assume the mantle of paterfamilias. While he was gone, which means we can infer this was around 172 or so, the Moors invaded Spain and threw the region into crisis. The Senate handed control of Baetica to the emperor, and in trade, the emperor granted the Senate authority over the island of Sardinia. So when he was ready to return to duty, Severus was redirected to the moderately hostile backwater of Sardinia, rather than the lush and wealthy coast of Spain. But Uncle Gaius still saw promise in the young man, though it should be admitted he was not quite so young anymore. He was serious and dedicated, and so when Gaius Severus was assigned the proconsulship of Africa, he picked his younger cousin to serve on his staff. In 175, the now 30-year-old Severus married a local African girl, and though they were married 11 years, she would die in 186, no children resulted from the union. Around that same time, he was the recipient of imperial favor, and appointed to serve as one of the now entirely honorary tribune of the plebs back in Rome. For the decade that followed, he would find him signed to key political and military posts across the empire, mostly in Spain and Gaul. When Commodus succeeded his father, Severus was close enough to the imperial family that Commodus trusted him, without being so close that Commodus felt threatened by him. Shortly after Lucilla's failed plot to kill her brother, though, Severus did temporarily fall from favor, when he botched, perhaps intentionally, the job of tracking down one of the conspirators who had fled east. But this was a minor blip on Severus's now firmly established record, and before too long, he was called back into service. In 186, Severus's first wife died, and he set himself to finding a new partner. This time, one he hoped would help catapult his career to the next level. Belief in astrology and divination was as strong in the empire as it had ever been, and Severus in particular bought into the whole system completely. He was informed by some mystics that there was a woman in the east who was destined to marry a king. So Severus immediately went forth to track her down and marry her. The woman in question was a Syrian named Julia Domna, who was descended from a line of kings established by Pompey during his initial political reorganization of the East in the 60s BC. Though her family's royalty had long been stripped away, her father was a high priest in the small but important mystery religion that dedicated itself to the worship of Elagabalus, god of the sun. Severus talked his way into an engagement with the woman who was destined to marry a king, and in the summer of 187, the two were wed. The marriage would prove to be a happy and fruitful one. Julia would go down as one of the more beloved empresses of all time, and apart from earning praise for her intelligence, wit, and political savvy, she was also a tireless promoter of the arts, philosophy, and poetry. Though she did her best to stem the tide, her work was largely a losing battle against a Greco-Roman culture that had stagnated and felt content to worship past masters rather than cultivate their generation's own voices. In 188, Severus's first son, Lucius Septimius Bassianus, was born, and in 189, a second son, Publius Septimius Geta, followed. Though the elder son would be known during his own life as Lucius, we know him today by the nickname that was rarely uttered in his presence, but which I'll use to refer to him from here on out, Caracalla. The feud with his younger brother Geta, the means by which he resolved said feud, and the tyrannical regime he subsequently oversaw following his father's death would become the stuff of legend, and Caracalla provided most, but not all of the reasons we usually call the Severan dynasty, the troubled Severan dynasty. Before we move on from Severus's growing nuclear family, though, I should mention that his new sister-in-law, Julia Maesa, will soon become a major player in her own right. It was her young grandsons, whom we know as Elagabalus and Alexander Severus, who will round out the ill-fated Severan dynasty. Both 14 at the time of their respective ascensions, Julia Maesa will wield considerable influence behind the scenes, and in her heyday was the most powerful Roman woman the empire had ever seen since the time of Agrippina. His family growing happily and rapidly, though what it grew into was an entirely different story, Severus finally received that bright feather political men still strove to put in their caps, despite its ultimate irrelevance, by being named consul in 190. As you'll recall, though, his consulship was even more irrelevant than most, his naming coming as it did in the middle of Cleander's scandalous list of 25 for the year. The following year, Severus was assigned to the key governorship of Pannonia, which brings us back to where we just began. The assassination of Commodus, the murder of Pertinax, the elevation of Julianus. Severus was willing to accept Pertinax, and so kept his men in check during what had to be at least a slightly chaotic period following Commodus's demise. But Julianus was not to be accepted, nor tolerated, nor even resigned to. Julianus was to be removed. Severus entered Rome in June 193 as the acknowledged master of the Roman Empire, king in all but name, just as the oracles had predicted. His first act was to order the disgraced Praetorian Guard to assemble unarmed on a plain outside the city walls, where they were surrounded by his own armed troops. The Praetorians were no doubt thinking that Severus's promise of no recriminations was about to be revealed as just a clever expedient, and that they were all about to pay the ultimate price for their greed and hubris, but Severus instead simply ordered them to disband. That is, the Praetorian Guard was abolished. the now former members of the Guard escaped with their lives, but found their livelihoods stripped away in an instant. In place of the old Praetorians, which had been an assembly of mostly Italian, mostly well-to-do soldiers, who treated the posting as purely ceremonial and little more than an opportunity to live high on the hog at the empire's expense, Severus instituted a new order of Praetorians. This one would be 4 times as large and be made up of provincial soldiers. Rather than a social club for pampered Italians, the Guard was reconstructed to be the premier military unit in the empire, and served as the ultimate reward for excellent service in the legions. Promotion to the Praetorians was, in other words, now open to any soldier who earned the right. The effects of this reconstruction were threefold. First, it further increased the distance between the citizens of Rome and their emperor. Rather than the barrier separating the two being made up of armed Italians, who at least looked like the citizens of Rome and talked like them, and were in many cases related to them, the barrier was now made up of a motley group of uncouth provincial soldiers who shared nothing in common with the citizenry of the capital. From this point on, basically, no one had a cousin in the Guard anymore who could, bend the rules a bit now and then. The ramification of the Praetorian reorganization was that it wound up draining away talent from the provinces. When the best soldiers are promoted up to a posting in Rome, well, they're not around to help dig trenches anymore, or lead men in battle, or generally ensure that the borders remain secure. Though only one of many factors that led to the disastrous barbarian invasions of the next century, it certainly didn't help that all the best men were stationed in Rome, rather than on the Danube, when the Goths came calling. Finally, when the old Guard was disbanded, they took with them the last few Italians still serving in uniform. The Roman legions were now no longer, in any sense, Roman legions. From here on out, wherever you looked, you saw foreign faces under those helmets. The Romans themselves were now content to let others do the fighting for them. This abandonment of their martial heritage is high on the list of potential reasons why the Western Empire ultimately fell. But as of yet, these reorganizations were still just a glimmer in Severus's eye. He had been recognized by the Senate and the Praetorians, but so what? So had the late Didius Julianus. Pescennius Niger was still in Syria, still in control of the resources of the Eastern Empire, and still showing every indication that he was planning to become emperor himself. Claudius Albinus was temporarily sated, but Severus knew that Albinus would not be so docile when the new emperor revealed his plan to double-cross his supposed heir, and instead name his sons Caracalla and Geta co-Caesars. Next week, Severus will face down his two rivals in a 3-way battle for power that will finally unlock the Pandora's box of civil war that the Romans had successfully kept shut for 125 years. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 100, Black and White and Severus All Over. On June 1st, 193 AD, Septimius Severus was officially recognized as emperor